The following scenario is hypothetical and presented for educational and entertainment purposes. The satellite images arrived first as a whisper, then as a scream. On a humid morning in late June, the orbital climate observatories that ring our planet like silent librarians began transmitting anomalies. The deep emerald mass that had dominated South America for millions of years, the Amazon rainforest, was fading, not burning, not slowly receding, simply vanishing, pixel by pixel, as though some unseen editor had begun erasing the largest living organism on Earth. At first, scientists suspected instrumentation error. Forest cover does not simply disappear overnight. Trees take centuries to grow and months to die. Ecosystems collapse in cascades, not in sudden absences. Yet every satellite, from Brazilian environmental monitors to European climate arrays, showed the same impossible pattern. Across an area larger than the continental United States, the dense canopy had thinned into scattered patches. Rivers that once snaked through a cathedral of leaves now cut through barren plains. Within 48 hours, the world understood something unprecedented had occurred. The Amazon rainforest was gone. To understand the magnitude of this loss, we have to remember what the Amazon truly is, not merely a forest, but a planetary machine. Covering roughly 5.5 million square kilometers, it has long functioned as Earth's most powerful biological engine. Each day, billions of trees pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, storing vast quantities of carbon in their trunks, roots, and soil. At the same time, those same trees pumped enormous volumes of water vapor into the air through a process known as evapotranspiration. In simple terms, the Amazon breathed. Every leaf acted like a microscopic pump, drawing water from the soil and releasing it into the sky. Collectively, the forest released around 20 billion tons of water vapor per day. This vapor formed towering atmospheric rivers, airborne currents that carried moisture across South America and even influenced rainfall patterns as far away as North America and Europe. Without the forest, that invisible circulation system collapses. Within weeks of the disappearance, meteorologists would notice the first disruption. Clouds over the Amazon basin would thin dramatically. The humid air columns that once rose above the canopy would weaken, reducing convective storms. Rainfall across Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia would begin to drop, not by small margins, but by as much as 30 to 40% in some regions. But the deeper shock would arrive not in the sky, but in the atmosphere's chemistry. For centuries, the Amazon acted as one of Earth's largest carbon sinks. Its trees stored an estimated 150 to 200 billion metric tons of carbon. When the forest vanished, that carbon did not simply vanish with it. The soil, roots, and decomposing biomass began releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere at staggering rates. Climate models had simulated scenarios where the Amazon slowly degraded over decades. None had prepared scientists for what happens when the entire system disappears at once. Within months, atmospheric CO2 levels would spike sharply, equivalent to decades of human emissions compressed into a single ecological shockwave. Global temperatures would not rise gradually anymore. They would jump. And yet the climate consequences were only the first layer of the catastrophe. Because the Amazon was never just a climate regulator. It was the most biologically complex place on Earth. Roughly 10% of all known species lived within that forest. Millions more had never even been cataloged. Insects, fungi, microbes, amphibians, birds, and plants formed a web of interactions so intricate that scientists often compared it to a living neural network. Remove the forest and you don't simply lose trees. You erase entire branches of life's evolutionary history. But what researchers did not realize in those first chaotic weeks was that the disappearance of the Amazon would trigger something far stranger than extinction. Because deep beneath the soil of the basin, locked away for millions of years, was a biological system that had never before been exposed to the open atmosphere. And now, for the first time in human history, it was waking up. The first true warning did not come from satellites or climate models. It came from the rivers. For centuries, the Amazon basin functioned like a vast circulatory system. Thousands of tributaries carried nutrients, sediments, and microscopic life through the rainforest, feeding the largest river network on Earth. Normally, the dense forest canopy regulated temperature, filtered runoff, and stabilized soil. The riverbanks were held together by immense root systems that had evolved over millions of years to keep the landscape intact. But when the forest vanished, those stabilizing systems vanished with it. Within weeks, hydrologists began detecting a radical shift in river chemistry. Without the protective canopy, the Amazon basin baked under direct equatorial sunlight. Surface temperatures across the exposed land began rising by 6 to 10 degrees Celsius compared to historic averages. The once moist forest floor dried rapidly, and the top layers of soil, previously protected by roots and organic matter, began to erode. Rainfall, already declining due to the collapse of evapotranspiration cycles, now hit bare ground with devastating efficiency. Instead of soaking slowly into the sponge-like forest soil, water rushed across the exposed terrain in violent sheets, carrying enormous quantities of sediment into the rivers. Within a month, satellite altimetry showed the Amazon River itself becoming darker, choked with minerals, clay, and decaying organic material that had once been part of the forest ecosystem. But it wasn't just sediment. Biogeochemists analyzing water samples found something far more unusual: sudden spikes in methane and dissolved carbon compounds. These signals pointed to the rapid decomposition of enormous amounts of previously buried organic matter. Beneath the rainforest soil lies one of the planet's largest stores of carbon-rich peat and ancient plant debris, material that had remained locked away in low oxygen conditions for millennia. Now exposed to heat and oxygen, it began to rot. The process was explosively efficient. Microbial communities that had evolved to thrive in these buried environments suddenly found themselves in a nutrient bonanza. They consumed the organic material at extraordinary speeds, releasing methane, a greenhouse gas over 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. Atmospheric monitoring stations in South America detected methane concentrations rising week by week. And that's when the climate system began shifting from disturbance to feedback. The additional greenhouse gases trapped more heat. The increased heat dried the soil further. Drier soil accelerated decomposition. Decomposition released more methane. In climate science, this is known as a positive feedback loop, a self-reinforcing cycle that pushes the system further away from stability. But even that wasn't the most alarming discovery. Geologists working in newly exposed sections of the basin reported something that climate models had never accounted for: vast networks of ancient wetlands and subterranean microbial ecosystems buried beneath layers of rainforest soil. These environments had existed in relative isolation for millions of years, protected by the dense forest above them. Now, with the forest gone, sunlight and oxygen began penetrating these ecosystems for the first time. Within weeks, strange biological blooms began appearing in stagnant river channels, thick mats of microbial colonies that glowed faintly at night and produced unfamiliar chemical signatures. Some released hydrogen sulfide. Others produced compounds no modern database could easily identify. To microbiologists, the implications were staggering. The Amazon had never been just a forest. It had been a biological vault, sealing away entire microbial worlds that had evolved in darkness and pressure, untouched by modern atmospheric conditions. Now, those organisms were spreading into rivers, wetlands, and the open air. And ecosystems are delicate networks. When a new biological actor enters the stage, especially one that has never interacted with modern species, the consequences can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Within 2 months, fish populations in parts of the Amazon River began dying in large numbers, not from heat, not from lack of oxygen, but from toxins that no laboratory could yet identify. Meanwhile, atmospheric scientists were noticing another anomaly forming thousands of kilometers away. The massive airborne rivers of moisture that once originated in the Amazon had vanished, and across South America, the skies were beginning to change. Because the disappearance of the forest was about to trigger the first major climatic climax, one that would transform entire continents. And when the winds finally shifted, the drought would not stay in the Amazon. By the third month, the world stopped asking what happened to the Amazon. The question had evolved into something far more urgent. What happens to Earth without it? For millions of years, the Amazon rainforest functioned as the beating heart of South America's climate system. Not metaphorically, literally. The forest generated gigantic atmospheric moisture flows scientists often called flying rivers. These were vast currents of humid air created when billions of trees released water vapor into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. Prevailing winds then carried that vapor westward and southward across the continent. The result was a self-sustaining rainfall engine. Moisture evaporated from the Atlantic Ocean, drifted inland, was recycled by the rainforest canopy several times, and then continued traveling as airborne rivers that fed rainfall across the Andes, the Brazilian plateau, and even into Argentina and Paraguay. Without the forest, the engine stalled. Within weeks of the Amazon's disappearance, satellite measurements showed a dramatic collapse in atmospheric humidity over central South America. The flying rivers had thinned to weak currents of dry air. Storm formation weakened, cloud cover diminished. At first, the shift seemed subtle. A slightly drier week in São Paulo, a delayed rainy season in Bolivia. Farmers noticed crops wilting earlier than expected. But climate systems rarely change linearly. They cross thresholds. By month 4, precipitation across large regions of Brazil had dropped nearly 50% compared to historical averages. Rivers that relied on seasonal rains began shrinking. Reservoir levels fell. Hydroelectric dams, responsible for roughly 2/3 of Brazil's electricity, started reporting dangerous declines in water supply. Cities dimmed their lights. Agriculture followed quickly behind. Soybean fields across southern Brazil began failing in waves. Corn harvests shrank dramatically. Ranchers in Argentina found their grazing lands turning brittle and yellow months ahead of schedule. What scientists were witnessing was the collapse of a continental moisture circulation loop. Without the Amazon pumping water vapor into the atmosphere, the entire rainfall distribution system across South America destabilized. Weather models predicted that if conditions persisted for even 2 years, vast areas of once fertile land could transition into semi-arid ecosystems. In other words, parts of South America could begin transforming into something resembling the Australian interior. But the shockwave didn't stop at continental borders. Atmospheric circulation is a global network. When one major heat and moisture engine disappears, pressure systems across the entire planet must rebalance. Within 6 months, climatologists began detecting anomalies in the Hadley circulation, the massive planetary-scale air currents that regulate tropical climate patterns. The disappearance of the Amazon had subtly altered the distribution of heat between the equator and mid-latitudes. This shifted the position of the intertropical convergence zone, the belt of storms that circles the Earth near the equator. And when that belt moves, the consequences ripple worldwide. West Africa began experiencing unusually weak monsoon rains. Southern Europe recorded one of the driest summers in recorded history. Meanwhile, parts of North America saw erratic storm tracks forming in places that normally remained calm. It was as though the atmosphere itself was trying to find a new equilibrium. But the most dramatic transformation occurred directly over the scar where the forest once stood. Without trees to absorb sunlight, the exposed land reflected and absorbed heat differently. Surface temperatures across the basin surged past 45 degrees Celsius in some regions during peak daylight. The hot ground created powerful thermal updrafts, sending columns of scorching air into the upper atmosphere. Meteorologists began observing a phenomenon rarely seen at such scale: a continental heat dome. The rising heat suppressed cloud formation even further, locking the basin into a self-perpetuating cycle of extreme dryness. Dust storms, once unheard of in the Amazon, began sweeping across what had once been dense rainforest. From orbit, astronauts described the site as surreal. Where there had once been a deep green ocean of life, there was now a vast, shimmering expanse of pale brown earth. A new biome was forming in real time. And yet, amid the dust and heat, scientists monitoring the region noticed something else, something even more puzzling than the drought. Satellite thermal scans began detecting patches of unexplained biological activity spreading across the basin floor. Not plants, not animals, but dense, rapidly expanding colonies of microorganisms, organisms that appeared to thrive in the extreme heat and chemical conditions left behind by the vanished forest. At first, researchers assumed they were simply opportunistic bacteria feeding on the remains of the old ecosystem. But genetic sequencing soon revealed something far stranger. These microbes weren't new. In fact, according to molecular clocks, some of them had last shared a common ancestor with modern life tens of millions of years ago. They had evolved in isolation beneath the rainforest for epochs. And now, with the forest gone, they were spreading across the basin at extraordinary speed. What no one yet understood was that these organisms were not just adapting to the new environment, they were reshaping it. And the changes they were about to trigger would push the planet toward the second and far more terrifying climax of this unfolding story. At first, the microbial expansion looked harmless. In the vast emptiness where the rainforest once stood, scattered patches of dark gelatinous film began spreading across the basin floor. From orbit, the formations resembled irregular stains, clusters of biological growth that followed moisture pockets left behind by the shrinking rivers. To most observers, they appeared insignificant against the backdrop of continental drought. But microbiologists studying samples from the basin knew something extraordinary was unfolding. The organisms colonizing the exposed soil were not typical surface microbes. Genetic analysis revealed that many belonged to ancient anaerobic lineages, microbial groups that had evolved in oxygen-poor environments deep beneath the forest floor. For millions of years, they had lived in isolated wetlands, buried sediments, and subterranean aquifers, surviving in chemical conditions radically different from the modern atmosphere. Now they were encountering sunlight, oxygen, and heat for the first time in their evolutionary history. And instead of dying off, they were thriving. Within weeks of exposure, these microorganisms began forming complex biofilms across the landscape, thin, cooperative communities where billions of cells work together as a single metabolic system. Each species performed a different chemical task. Some broke down ancient organic matter, others processed sulfur compounds. A few, alarmingly, appeared capable of converting atmospheric gases into exotic biochemical products. Researchers initially assumed the colonies would stabilize once nutrients from the old rainforest were exhausted. They were wrong. The microbes were not just consuming the past ecosystem, they were engineering a new one. Field teams reported that the colonies produced dark pigments that absorbed enormous amounts of solar radiation. The surface beneath them grew significantly hotter than surrounding areas, sometimes by as much as 12 degrees Celsius. This heat accelerated chemical reactions in the soil, releasing additional methane, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere. At the same time, other microbes in the colonies converted these gases into dense aerosol particles. And that's when atmospheric scientists began noticing a bizarre new phenomenon. High above the Amazon basin, the air was filling with unfamiliar organic aerosols, tiny particles produced by biological activity on the ground. Normally, aerosols from forests help seed cloud formation by giving water vapor something to condense around. But the particles generated by these microbial colonies behaved differently. Instead of encouraging rain, they suppressed it. Their chemical structure altered how sunlight scattered through the atmosphere, heating the air layers above the basin while keeping moisture trapped at lower altitudes. Meteorologists soon realized the microbes had inadvertently strengthened the massive heat dome already forming over the region. The basin was becoming a self-amplifying climate reactor. Temperatures rose further, soil dried faster, rivers evaporated more quickly, and the hotter the environment became, the faster the microbial colonies expanded. By the end of the first year, the Amazon basin had transformed into something no scientist had predicted: a vast extremophile ecosystem, dominated not by plants or animals, but by ancient microbial supercolonies visible from space. And these colonies were beginning to affect the planet in ways far beyond South America, because the aerosols they produced were no longer staying local. High-altitude winds carried them across the Atlantic, where atmospheric monitoring stations began detecting the particles drifting over Africa and Europe. At first, their concentrations were small, but as the colonies expanded, the aerosol plumes grew thicker. Climate models soon revealed the terrifying implication. If the microbial system continued expanding for another decade, it could significantly alter global cloud formation patterns, changing where rain falls across the entire planet. Some regions would grow wetter, others could dry catastrophically. But the most unsettling discovery emerged from chemical laboratories studying the colonies themselves. Among the thousands of compounds these microbes produced, scientists found a small group of previously unknown atmospheric catalysts, molecules capable of accelerating certain reactions in the upper atmosphere, reactions involving ozone. Normally, Earth's ozone layer is stabilized by a delicate balance of ultraviolet radiation and atmospheric chemistry. But these new compounds appeared to interact with ozone in ways no modern ecosystem had ever produced before. Initial models suggested the effects might be minor, until one atmospheric chemist ran a long-term simulation. When the projection finished, the room fell silent. Because if the microbial aerosols reached sufficient concentrations, they wouldn't just reshape rainfall. They could begin thinning the ozone layer itself. Not through industrial pollution, not through human activity, but through a planetary-scale biological process unleashed by the disappearance of a single ecosystem. And for the first time since the crisis began, scientists realized something chilling. The loss of the Amazon wasn't just causing environmental collapse. It might be triggering the birth of an entirely new planetary equilibrium, one where the world humans evolved and no longer existed. And if the simulations were correct, Earth's atmosphere might already be drifting toward that irreversible future. By the second year after the Amazon vanished, humanity faced a reality no civilization had ever confronted before. The planet was changing faster than the models could keep up. At first, the microbial aerosols drifting from the basin had seemed like a strange but localized anomaly. Yet as the extremophile colonies spread across millions of square kilometers, their atmospheric footprint expanded with them. Massive plumes of biologically generated particles rose from the basin each day, carried upward by the intense thermal currents of the heat dome. From there, global wind systems did the rest. Within 18 months, these aerosols had circled the planet. Climate monitoring stations from West Africa to Southeast Asia began detecting the same unusual chemical signatures in their upper atmosphere samples. The particles weren't identical to volcanic ash or industrial pollutants. Instead, they behaved like hybrid structures, part organic molecule, part mineral scaffold, designed unintentionally by microbial metabolism. And they were beginning to interact with sunlight in surprising ways. High in the stratosphere, the aerosols scattered incoming solar radiation differently than typical atmospheric particles. Some wavelengths were reflected back into space, slightly cooling the regions beneath them. Others were absorbed and re-radiated as heat, warming specific layers of the upper atmosphere. The result was subtle but profound. the thermal structure of Earth's atmosphere began shifting. Jet streams wobbled, storm tracks drifted north and south, monsoon cycles across Asia grew unpredictable, alternating between catastrophic flooding and devastating drought. Human civilization, which had spent thousands of years building agriculture and cities around relatively stable climate patterns, suddenly found those patterns dissolving. But the greatest concern remained the ozone layer. For decades, humanity had already faced the threat of ozone depletion caused by industrial chemicals like chlorofluorocarbons. Global agreements had slowly allowed the ozone layer to begin recovering. Scientists believed the worst was behind them, until now. Laboratories analyzing the microbial aerosols discovered that some of the exotic molecules they carried behaved as highly efficient catalytic agents in ozone reactions. When ultraviolet light struck these molecules in the upper atmosphere, they triggered chemical cycles capable of breaking apart ozone molecules faster than natural processes could rebuild them. At first, the changes were almost invisible. Satellite spectrometers detected only minor thinning, fractions of a percent across the tropics. But atmospheric chemistry is governed by feedback loops just as powerful as those in climate systems. Once certain catalytic cycles begin, they can accelerate rapidly if enough reactive molecules accumulate. And those molecules were arriving in increasing numbers every month. By the third year, researchers identified the first persistent ozone thinning corridor stretching across the equatorial Atlantic. Ultraviolet radiation levels beneath it began creeping upward. Crops exposed to the intensified UV light showed signs of cellular damage. Marine biologists reported declines in phytoplankton productivity in nearby waters, an alarming signal, since phytoplankton form the base of the ocean's food chain and produce a large share of the planet's oxygen. The chain reaction had begun. Ironically, the microbial ecosystems spreading across the former Amazon basin were not hostile to life. In many ways, they were simply doing what life has always done, adapting, evolving, and reshaping the environment to suit their metabolism. Earth itself had experienced transformations like this before. Billions of years ago, ancient cyanobacteria flooded the atmosphere with oxygen during the Great Oxidation Event, fundamentally altering the chemistry of the planet and triggering mass extinctions among organisms that could not tolerate oxygen-rich air. That transformation eventually paved the way for complex life, including humans. Now scientists realize they might be witnessing another planetary turning point, not driven by human industry, not by asteroid impact or volcanic catastrophe, but by a cascade of biological reactions unleashed when one of Earth's most complex ecosystems disappeared. The Amazon rainforest had once regulated climate, stored carbon, stabilized rainfall, and sheltered millions of species. Its sudden loss had cracked open a buried world of ancient microbes that were now rewriting the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. And the terrifying truth emerging from long-term simulations was this: even if humanity somehow replanted the forest tomorrow, even if trillions of trees could magically reappear across the basin, the new microbial ecosystems might not disappear. They had already adapted to the open landscape. They had already begun influencing global atmospheric cycles. In other words, the planet might have crossed a tipping point. Not a temporary environmental disaster, a permanent shift in Earth's operating system. Centuries from now, future scientists, whatever form they take, might study geological layers from this era and mark a single moment when the biosphere reorganized itself, a moment when a forest vanished and the planet became something new. Because ecosystems are not just collections of organisms, they are the hidden infrastructure of Earth's stability. Remove one of the largest systems ever built by life, and the consequences do not simply end. They evolve.